Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. You've come to rest in the wrong century again, and the candles are already lit. You didn't just open the cathedral doors. You whispered the Vespers, lulled him forward, and left the door open for the swords. If these stories have ever helped you sleep, or forget what you were supposed to worry about, thank you. Leave a comment with where in the world you're watching from and how long it takes you to drift away. Tonight you hush the monks, calm the wind, and let the blade fall before the bell rings for Compline. You watch the blood soak into the stones like it's ink from a quill. You guide it gently to the page. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of your limbs sink deeper into the mattress. The hush that fills the room as the story begins. The breath before the plunge. The stillness before sleep finds you. You're not here anymore. You're in the chill of Canterbury Cathedral, beneath vaulted stone and echoing footsteps. The incense clings to the robes, the candles bend in the draught. The monks are whispering. They know. So do you. You've sleepwalked here before, past the cloister, through the nave, and into the transept where something always waits. Tonight, it's 4 men in armour, and one who refuses to run. Sleep well. The sword is already raised. December 29, 1170 dawned with the kind of bitter cold that made even saints reconsider their commitment to suffering. Canterbury Cathedral, that monument to architectural ambition and ecclesiastical wealth, stood wrapped in frost like a warning written in ice. Inside, the preparations for Vespers proceeded with the mechanical precision of men who knew their routines might be the only normal thing about this particular evening. Thomas Becket moved through his day with the strange calm of someone who had either achieved perfect spiritual peace or had simply run out of energy for earthly concerns. He had celebrated Mass that morning with particular emphasis on martyrdom, because subtlety had never been his strong suit. The sermon had touched on themes of sacrifice, duty, and the crown of righteousness awaiting those who suffered for their faith. The congregation, swollen with curious locals and nervous monks, had listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for public executions. The warnings had been arriving all day like particularly persistent carolers. Messages from friends, hints from enemies, and increasingly frantic suggestions from his own household that perhaps, just perhaps, the Archbishop might want to be elsewhere when certain Norman knights arrived. Thomas received each warning with the same serene dismissal, as if danger was something that happened to other people who hadn't spent 6 years in exile perfecting their sense of righteous invulnerability. His routine continued with stubborn normalcy. Administrative duties were performed with the same attention to detail that had once made him England's most efficient chancellor. Letters were dictated, accounts reviewed, disputes arbitrated. It was as if Thomas was determined to prove that being Archbishop of Canterbury was a full-time position, right up until it suddenly wasn't. The household staff moved through their duties with the brittle efficiency of people pretending everything was fine while mentally updating their resumes. The kitchen prepared meals that no one seemed interested in eating. The clerks copied documents with unusual attention to accuracy, as if proper punctuation might ward off violence. Everyone was busy being normal, with the kind of intensity that suggested they knew normal was about to end. Edward Grimm, the visiting clerk who had arrived hoping to witness ecclesiastical administration and was about to witness something considerably more dramatic, later described the atmosphere as pregnant with doom. This was probably retrospective dramatization, but the December air did seem uncommonly heavy, the kind of atmospheric pressure that preceded storms or historical turning points. The 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy and Richard le Breton, had spent the night at Saltwood Castle, guests of Ranulph de Broc, who had his own collection of grievances against the Archbishop. They had refined their plan, such as it was, over wine that probably tasted of future regret. The plan remained simple. Confront Becket, demand submission, and when he inevitably refused, take whatever actions seemed necessary. It was the kind of plan that worked best if you didn't think about it too carefully. So they carefully didn't think. They set out for Canterbury after the midday meal, riding with the purposeful pace of men who had appointments with destiny and didn't want to be late. Their armour caught the weak December sun, creating brief flashes of light that observers would later interpret as omens. They were accompanied by a small force of men-at-arms, because even divinely inspired murder required backup. The journey from Saltwood to Canterbury was short but symbolically loaded. They passed through a landscape that had known Thomas Becket as Chancellor, as Archbishop, as exile, and was about to know him as martyr. Peasants in the fields paused to watch the armed party pass, with the instinctive wariness of people who knew that armed nobles travelling with purpose rarely meant good news for anyone. Back in Canterbury, Thomas prepared for Vespers with particular care. He had always been punctual about the divine offices, but today's punctuality had an edge of defiance to it. Whatever was coming, it would find him performing his duties, not cowering in some stronghold. He dressed in his archiepiscopal robes with the same attention he'd once given to his chancellor's finery, though the effect was somewhat different. Where once he'd dressed to impress, now he dressed to remind everyone, including himself, exactly what office he held. The cathedral bells began to ring for Vespers, their bronze voices carrying across the frozen city. It was a familiar sound, marking another moment in the endless cycle of prayer that gave medieval life its rhythm. But today, the bells seemed to ring with unusual urgency, as if they knew this would be a Vespers service unlike any other. The monks began to gather, moving through the cloisters with the measured pace of men who had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry. Some noticed unusual activity around the cathedral precincts, strangers loitering, horses being stabled with military efficiency, the kind of subtle wrongness that made experienced religious men nervous. But Vespers waited for no one, not even impending doom. Thomas made his way toward the cathedral through the covered walkway that connected his palace to the church. His household trailed behind him like reluctant participants in a procession they wished they could avoid. Some tried one last time to convince him to take precautions, to at least acknowledge the danger that everyone except Thomas seemed able to see. He brushed them off with the patience of someone who had made his decision and found continued debate tedious. The afternoon was already fading into evening, that uncertain December twilight when shadows grew long and definition became difficult. The cathedral loomed before them, its stones dark with age and damp, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight. It was a building designed to inspire awe and demonstrate the power of the church. Tonight, it would demonstrate something else entirely. As Thomas entered the cathedral, the four knights were entering Canterbury itself. They had left their horses at the inn and proceeded on foot, trying to blend in with the usual traffic of a cathedral city. Four armed men in mail were not exactly inconspicuous, but Canterbury had seen enough military comings and goings that they attracted attention without causing immediate alarm. They made their way first to the Archbishop's palace, expecting to find Thomas there. The palace, a sprawling complex that testified to the worldly success of Canterbury's archbishops, was less fortified than it might have been. Thomas had refused to turn his residence into a fortress, insisting that an archbishop shouldn't need to hide behind walls. This principled stance was about to prove tragically impractical. Finding the palace relatively undefended, the knights entered with the confidence of men who believed they were on official business, even if no official had actually authorized it. They demanded to see the archbishop, their voices carrying the kind of authority that came from sharp swords and noble birth. The palace staff, caught between their duty to their master and their desire not to be skewered, offered confused resistance. The confrontation in the palace was brief and unsatisfactory. Thomas was at Vespers, they were told. The knights, already edged with adrenaline and anticipation, found this delay infuriating. They had come to settle matters, and Thomas's absence felt like one more act of archiepiscopal defiance. They would go to the cathedral, they would find him there, and they would finish what they'd come to do. As they prepared to leave the palace, someone, history doesn't record who, made the fatal decision to arm themselves fully. They had entered as knights seeking audience. They would proceed as warriors seeking resolution. Helmets were donned, swords were loosened in their sheaths, and the last pretense of peaceful intention was abandoned. Meanwhile, in the cathedral, Vespers had begun. The familiar psalms rose into the vaulted ceiling, the Latin words worn smooth by centuries of repetition. Thomas participated with his usual attention, his voice joining the chorus of monks in the ancient rhythms of praise. If he was aware that armed men were approaching with lethal intent, he gave no sign of it. The service proceeded through its established patterns, psalms, readings, responses. Each element had its place, each movement its meaning. It was the kind of ritual that provided structure to monastic life, marking the passage of time with prayer rather than violence. But violence was coming whether the prayers acknowledged it or not. Outside, the December evening grew darker and colder. The last light faded from the sky, leaving only the glow from the cathedral windows to mark the sacred space. Inside, candles flickered in their sconces, casting dancing shadows on stone walls that had witnessed centuries of worship and were about to witness something altogether different. The monks sang on, their voices blending in harmonies that spoke of peace and divine order. Thomas stood in his stall, the Archbishop's place of honour, participating fully in the service he would never complete. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, between ordinary evening prayer and extraordinary historical event. And then, cutting through the sacred sounds of Vespers like a blade through silk, came the crash of armed men forcing their way into the cathedral. The 4 knights had arrived, and with them came the end of everything Thomas Becket had been, and the beginning of everything he would become. The cold day for Vespers was about to become considerably colder. The arrival of 4 armoured knights in Canterbury Cathedral during Vespers was about as subtle as a war cry at a wedding. They burst through the doors with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for besieging castles, not entering churches. The sound of mail on stone, swords clanking against pillars, and heavy breathing from men who'd worked themselves into a homicidal enthusiasm echoed through the sacred space like a very martial hymn. Reginald Fitzurse led the charge, if it could be called that when your opponents were monks at prayer. He was followed by his 3 companions, each looking like they'd dressed for battle but arrived at a prayer service. Their appearance in full armour inside a cathedral was so inappropriate it almost circled back to being appropriate, in the way that extreme violations of protocol sometimes achieve their own horrible logic. The monks' reaction was predictable and varied. Some froze in mid-psalm, their mouths open in perfect O's of surprise, others scattered like startled pigeons, their habits fluttering as they sought cover behind pillars, altars, or each other. A few of the braver or more confused ones actually continued singing, as if proper Latin pronunciation might protect them from sharp steel. "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and realm?" Fitzurse's voice boomed through the cathedral with the subtlety of a trebuchet. It was not a question designed to elicit helpful directions. It was a declaration of intent wrapped in an interrogative, the kind of question that came with its own violent answer. The monks, displaying the kind of helpful spirit that made medieval Christianity so endearing, pointed in various directions, none of them particularly accurate. Some pointed to the crypt, others to the choir. A few imaginative souls gestured vaguely heavenward. It was less misdirection and more panic expressed through geometry. Thomas himself, hearing the commotion, displayed the kind of calm that was either saintly or suicidal. He did not flee, he did not hide, he did not even hurry. Instead, he finished the prayer he was reciting, because apparently proper liturgical form was more important than personal survival. It was the kind of priority system that made martyrs and exasperated everyone else. The knights, finding their dramatic entrance somewhat undermined by the absence of their target, began what could charitably be called a search, and more accurately called a rampage. They overturned prayer stools, scattered manuscripts, and generally behaved like men who'd expected immediate confrontation and were annoyed by having to look for it. Their armour, designed for battlefield mobility, proved less practical in a cathedral setting. They clanked and crashed through the sacred space, occasionally getting caught on decorative elements or slipping on the polished stones. It would have been comic if it weren't so clearly heading toward tragedy. Some of Thomas's household, displaying more courage than sense, attempted to bar the knight's way. These brave souls, armed with nothing more than moral indignation and possibly some candlesticks, stood about as much chance as grass before a scythe. They were brushed aside with the casual violence of men who had bigger prey in mind. The search took on an increasingly frantic quality. The cathedral was large, full of chapels, alcoves, and architectural complexities that made finding one archbishop harder than it should have been. The knights split up, then regrouped, their frustration mounting with each empty chapel and archbishopless altar. Meanwhile, Thomas was being urged by his monks to take sanctuary. They pulled at his robes, pleaded with his reason, appealed to his sense of self-preservation. Thomas responded with theological arguments about duty and divine will, which was exactly the wrong currency to use with men trying to save your life. He would not hide. He would not flee. He would meet whatever came with the dignity of his office. The standoff between Thomas's determination to be found and the knight's determination to find him created a brief, bizarre moment where both sides were working toward the same terrible goal. The monks found themselves in the impossible position of trying to hide someone who refused to be hidden from people who were going to find him anyway. Finally, almost anticlimactically, they met. Thomas, proceeding with deliberate dignity toward the altar, encountered the knights in the north transept. For a moment, nobody moved. It was as if both sides needed a moment to process that the confrontation they'd been building toward was actually happening. The knights, now face to face with their quarry, seemed momentarily uncertain. They had worked themselves into a righteous fury about treacherous priests and royal insults. But Thomas, standing there in his archiepiscopal robes, was a different reality from Thomas the abstract enemy. He looked less like a traitor and more like what he was, a middle-aged cleric in expensive vestments. Fitzurse recovered first, remembering his lines in this deadly drama. He repeated his demands. Thomas must absolve the excommunicated bishops, submit to royal judgment, and generally stop being such an ecclesiastical nuisance. It was the same list that had been circulating for years, now delivered at sword point. Thomas's response was predictably uncompromising. He would not absolve bishops who had violated church law. He would not submit to secular authority in spiritual matters. He would not, in short, do anything that four-armed knights demanded, no matter how sharp their arguments. It was magnificent intransigence, perfectly timed for maximum provocation. The other three knights, de Morville, de Tracy and Le Breton, arranged themselves in supporting positions, like actors who knew their cues were coming. They had not spoken much, letting Fitzurse handle the negotiations such as they were, but their presence spoke volumes. This was not a debate, but a countdown. The cathedral around them seemed to hold its breath. The candles flickered in the draught from the open doors. The abandoned service books lay scattered where monks had dropped them in flight. The very stones seemed to lean in, witnesses to what was about to unfold. Thomas, perhaps recognizing that words were becoming increasingly irrelevant, began to pray. Not the formal Latin of the service, but something more personal, more immediate. The knights, already past the point of theological discussion, moved closer. The space between them narrowed, from feet to inches to inevitability. One of the monks, braver or more foolish than the rest, tried to intervene. He placed himself between Thomas and the knights, appealing to whatever Christian conscience might lurk beneath their mail. The knights brushed him aside like an inconvenient furniture, focused entirely on their target. The conversation, such as it was, had devolved into demands and refusals, threats and defiance. Thomas would not yield. The knights would not relent. Something had to break, and in medieval politics, it was usually the person with fewer swords. Fitzurse made one last attempt at forcing compliance without violence. He grabbed Thomas's cloak, trying to drag him from the cathedral. Perhaps he thought that if they could get Thomas outside, what followed would be less sacrilegious. Or perhaps he was simply going through the motions of giving Thomas chances he knew wouldn't be taken. Thomas resisted with surprising strength for someone who'd spent years in austere exile. He gripped a pillar, anchoring himself to the cathedral with determination that was part principle, part theatre. He would not be dragged anywhere. If they were going to do this, they would do it here, in God's house, where the blasphemy would be complete and undeniable. The physical struggle was brief and undignified. 4 armed knights versus 1 unarmed archbishop should have been no contest. But Thomas's resistance and the awkwardness of the space made it harder than expected. They pulled, he resisted. They threatened, he prayed. It was deadlock, broken only by escalation. Finally, Fitzurse stepped back and drew his sword. The sound of steel leaving its sheath in a cathedral was like a bell tolling for all the wrong reasons. The other knights followed suit. The time for words had passed. The The time for steel had come. The entry that had been loud was about to become louder. The uninvited guests were about to become something worse, and Thomas Becket, standing in his cathedral, surrounded by drawn swords, was about to discover that some invitations are written in blood. The north transept of Canterbury Cathedral had been designed for prayer, not combat. Its soaring arches and devotional alcoves made excellent acoustic spaces for chanting, but terrible tactical positions for assassination. The knights, finding themselves in this architectural prayer box with an uncooperative archbishop, began to realize that murdering someone in a cathedral was more complicated than their planning had suggested. Thomas's monks, displaying the kind of loyalty that was either admirable or misguided, attempted to form a human shield around their archbishop. It was touching, but futile, like trying to stop a flood with good intentions. These were men trained in manuscripts and meditation, not military maneuvers. Their defensive formation had all the effectiveness of a strongly worded letter against a battering ram. "Get him out of here!" someone shouted, possibly Prior William, possibly another monk, possibly the collective panic of everyone present. Hands grabbed at Thomas's robes, trying to pull him toward the crypt, where he might be safe, or at least where his murder would be more difficult to accomplish. It was the kind of plan born of desperation and implemented with chaos. Thomas, however, had developed an immunity to good advice that would have impressed even the most stubborn mule. He refused to move, refused to hide, refused to do anything that might be interpreted as cowardice or lack of faith. "I will not flee," he declared with the kind of certainty that made everyone else wish they could. "This is God's house, and I will not turn it into a fortress." It was a theologically sound position that ignored the practical reality of 4 armed men with sharp swords and flexible morals. The cathedral might be God's house, but God appeared to be out, and the current tenants had violence on their minds. The monks tried reasoning with him, which was like trying to reason with a cathedral pillar, solid, immovable, and frustratingly principled. They pointed out that discretion was the better part of valor, that living to fight another day had biblical precedent, that even Jesus had fled from his enemies when necessary. Thomas countered with his own theological arguments, creating a deadly delay while armed men closed in. The knights, meanwhile, were experiencing their own difficulties. The transept was crowded with liturgical furniture, decorative elements, and panicking religious personnel. Their battlefield charge kept getting interrupted by the need to navigate around prayer stands and over prostrate monks. It was like trying to conduct a murder in an obstacle course designed by particularly devout architects. Fitzurse, apparently deciding that subtle approach had failed, raised his sword and brought it down on Thomas's head, or tried to. Edward Grimm, that visiting clerk who'd come for administrative education and was getting a very different kind of lesson, threw up his arm to block the blow. The sword cut deep into Grimm's arm, nearly severing it, but deflected enough to merely graze Thomas's scalp. Blood appeared, bright against the archbishop's pale skin. It was not a fatal wound, barely more than the kind of cut overzealous barbers sometimes inflicted, but it was blood, drawn in a cathedral, and everyone knew there was no going back from that. The theological Rubicon had been crossed with steel. Thomas, blood trickling down his face, maintained his standing position with the stubbornness of someone who'd decided that dignity was worth dying for. He did not cry out, did not plead, did not do any of the things that might have satisfied the knight's need for submission. Instead, he began to pray, loudly and in Latin, as if proper pronunciation might provide protection that his monks could not. The other monks scattered like leaves before a storm. Some fled to the darkest corners of the cathedral, others prostrated themselves, hoping that extreme piety might make them invisible to armed violence. A few of the braver ones continued trying to reach Thomas, but the forest of swords made approach impossible. The transept had become a trap, but it was unclear who was trapped. The knights had their quarry cornered, but the sacred space constrained their movements. Thomas couldn't escape, but his refusal to flee meant the knights had to commit their crime in the most public, most sacred way possible. Everyone was caught in a tableau of inevitable violence. De Tracy, perhaps frustrated by the delays or perhaps just more practical than his companions, struck the second blow. This one landed properly, opening Thomas's skull with the wet sound of a melon being split. Thomas dropped to his knees, finally brought low, but still maintaining the kind of posture that suggested he was kneeling by choice rather than necessity. Blood flowed more freely now, pooling on the stone floor in patterns that would later be interpreted as miraculous, but were really just following the grooves worn by centuries of genuflection. The sight of their archbishop bleeding in his own cathedral sent the remaining monks into fresh panic. Some prayed louder, as if volume might reverse violence. Others simply stared, frozen by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Thomas, on his knees but still conscious, managed to speak. His words, reported differently by different witnesses but all agreeing on the general theme, accepted his death for the Church's sake. It was the kind of statement that sounded rehearsed because it probably was. Thomas had been preparing for martyrdom, consciously or not, for years. Now that it had arrived, he wasn't going to waste it with improvisation. The third blow came from Le Breton, delivered with enough force to finish what de Tracy had started. Thomas pitched forward, his final position a grotesque parody of prayer. The archbishop, who had stood so proudly, was now prostrate, his blood mixing with the dust of his cathedral floor. But even this wasn't enough. Hugh de Morville, who had thus far been more observer than participant, delivered a final blow, so violent that it scattered Thomas's brains across the stones and broke the sword on the pavement. It was excessive even by the standards of medieval violence, the kind of overkill that suggested personal animosity or simple loss of control. The transept fell silent, except for the sound of blood dripping and monks hyperventilating. The four knights stood over Thomas's body like men waking from a dream or entering a nightmare. They had done what they came to do, but the doing of it had transformed them from royal agents into sacrilegious murderers. The trap had closed, but not on Thomas. He was beyond all traps now, elevated by violence into something more than he'd been. The knights, standing in a cathedral transept with blood on their swords and horror dawning in their hearts, were the ones truly trapped. They had solved Henry's Becket problem by creating a far worse one, a martyred saint whose blood cried out from cathedral stones. One of the knights, accounts differ on which, used his sword to scatter more of Thomas's brains, as if trying to ensure he was thoroughly dead. It was the kind of precaution that was both unnecessary and telling. They had come to silence Thomas Becket, and they wanted to make sure he stayed silent. But martyrs, as the knights would soon learn, were often louder in death than in life. The transept that had trapped Thomas's body had released something far more dangerous, a symbol that would outlive them all. The blood on the stones was already becoming sacred. The scattered brains were already becoming relics. The murdered archbishop was already becoming St. Thomas. The monks began to emerge from their hiding places, drawn by the terrible silence that followed violence. They approached their archbishop's body with the tentative steps of men entering a holy of holies that had been violently consecrated. Some knelt in prayer, others simply stared, trying to process how their ordinary Vespers had become extraordinary history. The moment Reginald Fitzurse raised his sword in Canterbury Cathedral, time seemed to develop the consistency of thick honey. Witnesses would later disagree on details, but agree on the terrible clarity of that instant when steel first met sanctity. The sword rose, caught candlelight along its edge like a premonition, and began its descent toward Thomas Becket's uncovered head. Edward Grimm, that unfortunate clerk whose timing had brought him to Canterbury for this worst of all possible Vespers, saw the blow coming with the clarity of impending disaster. His reaction was instinctive rather than calculated. He threw up his arm to block the sword, possibly thinking that Clark's limbs had some special immunity to military steel. They didn't. The sword cut through Grimm's arm with the ease of sharp metal through insufficient faith. Blood spurted in an arc that would have been artistic if it weren't so immediately personal. Grimm screamed, stumbled, and discovered that being a passive observer of historical events was much preferable to active participation. His sacrifice, however, had deflected the blow enough that it merely scalped Thomas rather than splitting his skull. The first blood drawn was thus not entirely Thomas's, which added a layer of complexity to what was already a theologically complicated situation. Grimm's blood mixed with Thomas's on the cathedral floor, creating patterns that would later inspire considerable interpretative creativity. But in the moment it was simply blood, warm and red and indicative of how badly things were going. Thomas's reaction to being scalped was remarkably composed for someone experiencing improvised tonsure by sword. He touched his head, looked at the blood on his fingers with the expression of a man confirming an expected diagnosis, and continued standing. Blood ran down his face in rivulets that followed the lines etched by years of frowning at royal policy. "Strike! Strike!" Fitzurse shouted, though it wasn't clear if he was encouraging his companions or himself. The first blow was always the hardest. It transformed theoretical murder into practical homicide. Once blood was drawn in a cathedral, the only direction was forward, preferably quickly, before anyone had time to think about eternal damnation. The other knights seemed momentarily frozen by the reality of what they were doing. They had arrived full of righteous fury about treacherous priests and insulted kings, but Thomas standing there, blood running down his face but still maintaining his archiepiscopal dignity, was a different proposition from Thomas the abstract enemy. He looked distressingly human. Thomas, perhaps recognizing that negotiations had definitively concluded, began to pray more loudly. His Latin was impeccable, even under stress, which was either admirable or irritating, depending on your perspective. He commended his soul to God, the Church, and various saints, creating a kind of spiritual inventory while blood continued to flow from his scalp. The monks who hadn't fled were frozen in tableau of horror. Some had their mouths open in screams that seemed to have gotten stuck somewhere between their lungs and the air. Others were on their knees, though whether in prayer or simply because their legs had given up was unclear. The cathedral itself seemed to recoil, its stones groaning with the weight of sacrilege. Fitzurse, having started this bloody business, seemed uncertain how to continue. The first blow had been meant to be decisive, but Thomas's continued standing suggested either poor swordsmanship or divine intervention. Medieval knights were trained for battlefield combat, where opponents had the decency to wear armour and fight back. Murdering an unarmed cleric required different skills. Blood continued to flow from Thomas's scalp wound, creating an involuntary parody of the red vestments he sometimes wore. It dripped onto his archiepiscopal robes, onto the cathedral floor, onto the scattered prayer books that monks had dropped in their flight. Each drop was a punctuation mark in a sentence that could only end one way. The sight of their archbishop, bloodied but unbowed, created a curious reaction among the witnesses. Some were inspired to fresh attempts at intervention, throwing themselves between Thomas and his attackers with the effectiveness of butterflies against a windstorm. Others seemed paralyzed by the theological implications of what they were seeing. Was this martyrdom in progress? Should they be taking notes? Grimm, meanwhile, was discovering that heroic intervention came with significant personal costs. His nearly severed arm hung useless at his side, blood flowing with enthusiasm that suggested major arterial involvement. He staggered away from the confrontation, leaving a trail that would later be followed by pilgrims but was currently just evidence of poor tactical decisions. Thomas wiped blood from his eyes with the same gesture he might have used to clear away sweat during a particularly intense theological debate. He was still standing, still praying, still refusing to make this easy for anyone. It was as if he was determined to make his murder as awkward and memorable as possible. The first blow had failed in its primary purpose, but succeeded in crossing the line between threat and action. There was no walking back from a bloody sword in a cathedral. The knights had begun something that could only end with Thomas dead, or themselves guilty of the most spectacular failure in the history of political assassination. Fitzurse raised his sword again, this time with the grim determination of a man who'd started a job and needed to finish it. The other knights moved closer, their own swords ready. The first blow had been shocking in its singularity. What came next would be shocking in its multiplicity. Thomas saw them coming and did nothing to avoid them. He didn't run, didn't dodge, didn't even raise his hands in defense. He stood there, blood-streaked and praying, like a man who'd been waiting for this moment, and wasn't going to spoil it with undignified scrambling. It was either the ultimate expression of faith or the ultimate expression of stubbornness, and with Thomas, the distinction had always been unclear. The cathedral held its breath. The candles flickered as if considering whether to extinguish themselves rather than illuminate what was coming. The very air seemed to thicken with anticipation and dread. The first blow had been struck, but it was only the overture to a symphony of violence that would echo through centuries. And still Thomas stood, bleeding but unbroken, praying but not pleading, a man caught between earth and heaven, with several swords eager to complete his journey. The first blow had failed to fell him, but there were 3 more knights with sharp steel and diminishing patience. Mathematics, if not theology, was on their side. While 4 knights settled into Canterbury with the grim patience of men preparing for distasteful but necessary work, Thomas Becket continued his archiepiscopal duties with either sublime ignorance of danger or sublime indifference to it. December 28, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, found him conducting services with particular emphasis on martyrdom, which in retrospect seems either prescient or provocative. The atmosphere in Canterbury Cathedral was electric, with the kind of tension that precedes thunderstorms or catastrophes. Thomas's household, more politically astute than their master, or simply more attached to continuing breathing, had noticed the arrival of armed strangers. Whispers of Norman knights with uncertain business circulated through the cathedral precincts like incense smoke, but darker and more ominous. Thomas himself seemed energized rather than alarmed by the growing tension. His sermon on December 28 was a masterpiece of aggressive spirituality, comparing the sufferings of the Holy Innocents to the sufferings of the English Church under royal oppression. The congregation, used to more conventional homilies, listened with the fascination of people watching someone juggle fire in a gunpowder store. His routine continued with mechanical precision. Morning prayers, administrative duties, correspondence that continued his campaign of ecclesiastical warfare. He dictated letters with the same certainty that had characterized his exile, as if 6 years of failure to achieve his goals had only reinforced his conviction that he was right. Each letter was another small act of defiance, another assertion that spiritual authority superseded temporal power. The monks of Canterbury watched their archbishop with growing alarm. Some tried to suggest that perhaps a lower profile might be wise given the circumstances. Thomas responded with canon law and theological certainty. Others hinted that the arrival of Norman knights might warrant precautions. Thomas replied with scripture about shepherds who didn't flee from wolves. It was magnificent, principled, and utterly impractical. Edward Grimm, a visiting clerk who would soon become an eyewitness to history, later described Thomas's demeanour as tranquil as a man who had already conquered the world. This tranquility might have been spiritual achievement, or simple stubbornness elevated to theological principle. Either way, it was about to be severely tested. Messages arrived throughout December 28 warning of danger. Local supporters reported the knight's presence and probable intentions. Friendly nobles suggested that perhaps a strategic withdrawal might be prudent. Even some of his enemies, apparently preferring a live opponent to a dead martyr, sent hints that December 29 might be an excellent day to be elsewhere. Thomas ignored them all, with the serene certainty of someone who decided that being right was more important than being alive. The knights, meanwhile, spent December 28 in final preparations. They attended to their equipment with the methodical care of professionals. Swords were sharpened, mail was checked, plans were refined. They probably attended Mass, because medieval logic saw no contradiction between preparing for murder and maintaining religious observances. God, in their view, would understand that they were serving their earthly king. Their plan had evolved from vague intention to specific action. They would confront Thomas publicly, demand his submission to royal authority, and when he refused, as he certainly would, they would have justification for whatever followed. It was the kind of plan that made perfect sense if you were a medieval knight, and no sense at all if you were anyone else. The evening of December 28 saw unusual activity around the cathedral. Thomas's supporters, finally convincing him that some precautions might be wise, increased the guard and checked the locks. It was a futile gesture. 4 determined knights weren't going to be stopped by medieval security, but it made everyone feel like they were doing something. Thomas himself spent the evening in prayer and correspondence. His last letters showed no awareness of specific danger, just the same themes he'd pursued for 6 years: the independence of the church, the wickedness of royal interference, the righteousness of his cause. He was a man writing his principles in stone, unaware that stones were about to become irrelevant. The night passed quietly, which, in medieval narratives, usually means ominously. The night slept the sleep of men with clear consciences, or no consciences at all. Thomas probably slept poorly, though whether from premonition or just the December cold in a medieval bedroom is unknown. The monks kept vigil, praying for peace while preparing for something worse. December 29 dawned grey and bitter, the kind of morning that suggested God was in a mood. Thomas rose for prime with his usual punctuality, celebrating the morning office as if it were any other day. His sermon touched on themes of sacrifice and duty, words that would echo differently in retrospect. The congregation, swollen with curious locals who'd heard rumours, listened with unusual attention. After the morning services, Thomas retired to his chambers for the administrative work that even impending doom couldn't postpone. He reviewed accounts, settled disputes, and generally demonstrated that being Archbishop of Canterbury involved more paperwork than anyone expected. It was mundane work performed under extraordinary circumstances, like updating spreadsheets during an earthquake. The knights made their move after dinner, that medieval meal taken around midday. They arrived at the Archbishop's palace not as assassins but as royal officers demanding audience. They'd decided to give Thomas one last chance to submit, though they probably hoped he wouldn't take it. Martyrs were made by defiance, and Thomas had never disappointed when defiance was required. The first confrontation was almost civilized. The knights were admitted to Thomas's chamber, where they found him surrounded by clerks and conducting business. They stated their demands. Thomas must absolve the excommunicated bishops, submit to royal authority, and generally stop being so troublesome. It was a familiar list, presented with military directness. Thomas's response was predictably uncompromising. He would not absolve bishops who had violated church law. He would not submit to authority that contradicted divine will. He would not, in short, do anything the knights demanded. It was the response they'd expected and probably wanted. Negotiations were over before they began. The confrontation escalated quickly. Voices raised, threats were made, hands moved to sword hilts. Thomas's clerks tried to intervene, to moderate, to prevent the inevitable. But momentum had been building for 6 years, and 4 knights with sharp swords were unlikely to be stopped by sharp words. The knights withdrew, but only to arm themselves fully. The pretense of negotiation was over. When they returned, it would be as executioners rather than envoys. Thomas's household, finally understanding that this was not another theological debate but a mortal threat, tried to convince their archbishop to flee, or at least take sanctuary in the cathedral. Thomas's response was characteristic. He would not flee like a coward. He would not hide from men doing Satan's work. He would meet whatever came with the dignity of his office and the certainty of his cause. It was magnificent, infuriating, and about to be fatal. The storm had been gathering for 6 years. Now it was about to break, and Thomas Becket stood directly in its path, arms spread wide, daring lightning to strike. The immediate aftermath of Thomas Becket's murder had the quality of a nightmare from which nobody could quite wake. The cathedral, so recently filled with the sounds of violence, now echoed with a different kind of noise. The shuffling of feet in blood, the whispered prayers of traumatized monks, and the steady drip of various fluids that no one wanted to identify too closely. The 4 knights stood in the spreading pool of consequences, their swords still drawn, but increasingly pointless. You couldn't threaten a corpse. And everyone else was either fled or too shocked to require intimidation. They looked at each other with the expressions of men who'd followed their logic to its conclusion and found the conclusion involved rather more blood and brain matter than anticipated. Fitzurse, as the informal leader of this thoroughly formal disaster, tried to take charge. "The deed is done," he announced, which was both obviously true and spectacularly inadequate. He sheathed his sword with the careful movements of someone trying to restore normalcy to a situation that had left normal several sword strokes ago. The other knights followed suit, their movements mechanical. They were warriors trained for battle, where dead enemies were victories to be celebrated. But this didn't feel like victory. It felt like something else entirely. Something that didn't have a convenient name, but definitely had eternal consequences attached. Around them, the cathedral began to reorganize itself around the new reality of a dead archbishop. Monks emerged from various hiding places like medieval prairie dogs, checking if the predators had gone. They approached Thomas's body with the tentative steps of people unsure whether they were approaching a crime scene or a shrine. Prior William took charge with the efficiency of someone used to managing crises, though admittedly none quite like this. He ordered some monks to tend to the body, others to secure the cathedral, and a few of the more articulate ones to begin documenting everything. Medieval administrators understood that paperwork was immortal, even if archbishops weren't. The body itself presented both practical and theological problems. Thomas lay in an expanding pool of his own blood, his brains scattered in a pattern that would require creative cleaning. But this wasn't just any body. It was the body of an archbishop murdered in his own cathedral, which made it simultaneously evidence, relic, and problem. The monks' first instinct was to gather the scattered pieces of their archbishop. Using whatever came to hand, cloths, vessels, their own garments, they began collecting blood and brain matter with the reverence usually reserved for communion elements. Every fragment was precious, every drop sacred. Thomas had spent years being difficult. In death, he was becoming divine. The knights, watching this transformation beginning, seemed to realize they needed to leave. Whatever they'd expected, submission, exile, even simple death, this wasn't it. The creation of a martyr hadn't been part of the plan, mostly because there hadn't really been a plan beyond solve the Becket problem with swords. They backed toward the door, their boots leaving bloody footprints that would later be preserved under crystal. No one tried to stop them. What was the point? The deed was done. The archbishop was dead, and attempting to arrest 4 armed knights with a traumatized monastery staff seemed like adding farce to tragedy. As they left, one of them, again accounts differ, shouted something about the king's justice being done. It fell flat in the blood-scented air. Justice was a complicated concept at the best of times, and these were definitively not the best of times. They departed into the December night, leaving Canterbury Cathedral to deal with its new reality. The news began to spread with the speed that only catastrophe achieves. Messengers were dispatched in all directions, carrying word that would transform kingdoms and consciences. The Archbishop of Canterbury was dead, murdered in his cathedral by knights claiming royal authority. It was the kind of news that required no embellishment. The bare facts were shocking enough. Inside the cathedral, a peculiar transformation was taking place. The monks, initially paralyzed by horror, were beginning to understand what they had. Not just a dead archbishop, but a martyred saint. Not just spilled blood, but sacred relics. Not just a crime scene, but a shrine. The speed of this transformation would have impressed Thomas, who had always appreciated efficiency. They prepared the body with care that mixed practical necessity with emerging veneration. The ruined skull was wrapped. The blood-soaked vestments were preserved. Every trace of the murder was documented and sanctified. They were creating the cult of St. Thomas before his body was even cold, with the instinctive understanding that martyrdom was a marketing opportunity that shouldn't be wasted. Candles were lit around the body, their flames flickering in the drafts that came through doors the knights had left open. The light played across the blood pools, creating reflections that looked like halos or hellfire, depending on the viewer's theological position. The cathedral, so recently a place of violence, was beginning its transformation into a place of pilgrimage. Outside, snow began to fall, because December in England had a sense of dramatic timing. The flakes settled on the cathedral roof, on the bloody footprints leading away from the door, on a world that had just shifted in fundamental ways. The snow covered the knights' tracks, but couldn't cover what they'd done. Prior William organised the practical matters with admirable efficiency. The cathedral needed to be reconsecrated, the body properly prepared, the narrative controlled. He understood that they weren't just dealing with a murder, but with the birth of something that would outlive them all. Every decision made in these first hours would echo through centuries. The monks began to compose themselves, shock giving way to purpose. They had work to do, sacred work, historical work, the work of turning tragedy into triumph. Thomas had given them the raw material, they would craft the legend. It was what he would have wanted, probably. He'd always appreciated good theatre. As midnight approached, bringing December 30 and a new day that would have to somehow accommodate this new reality, Canterbury Cathedral settled into an exhausted vigil. The body of Thomas Becket lay surrounded by candles and kneeling monks, already less corpse and more icon. The blood on the floor was already being diluted with water and collected in vessels, creating a seemingly endless supply of sacred fluid. The scattered brain matter was gathered with reverence that would have amused Thomas, who'd often complained about people not using their brains. Now his were being treated as the most precious substance in Christendom. Messages continued to fly from Canterbury like very urgent birds, to the Pope, to the King, to bishops and nobles, and anyone who needed to know that the world had just changed. Each message carried the same essential information, but coloured by the sender's perspective. To some it was murder most foul, to others it was martyrdom most glorious, to Henry it would be a problem most significant. The four knights rode through the snowy night, perhaps beginning to understand what they'd done. They had solved the immediate problem of Thomas Becket, but created the eternal problem of St. Thomas. They had silenced the troublesome priest, but given him a voice that would speak through centuries. They had won the battle and lost absolutely everything else. In Canterbury Cathedral, the candles burned low but were constantly replaced. The vigil around Thomas's body would continue through the night, through the next day, through the centuries. The blood would be diluted and distributed until it seemed Thomas had contained more fluid than humanly possible. The story would be told and retold, gaining details and losing others, until it became less history and more myth. But on this night, December 29, 1170, it was still raw, still real, still shocking. An archbishop lay dead on his cathedral floor, his brains scattered by knights who thought they were serving their king. Candles flickered in the darkness, illuminating a scene that would be painted, sculpted and dramatized for centuries to come. The consequences were already rippling outward like blood spreading across stone. Henry would do penance, the knights would be excommunicated, Thomas would be canonized, Canterbury would become one of Christianity's great pilgrimage sites. But all of that was still to come, for now there were just candles and consequences, blood and beginning legend. Snow continued to fall on Canterbury, covering the medieval city in white that made the blood inside seem even redder. The cathedral bells, which had rung for Vespers so few hours ago, now tolled for the dead, their bronze voices carrying news that needed no words. Thomas Becket was dead. Long live St. Thomas. The troublesome priest had found the ultimate solution to being troublesome. He'd become eternal. And in the candlelit darkness of Canterbury Cathedral, his transformation from man to myth was already beginning. Sleep well, Thomas. Your argument is over, your point finally and definitively made. You've achieved the martyrdom that your enemies gave you and that you seemed almost to seek. The candles burn for you now and will burn forever, or at least as long as people remember that sometimes principles are worth dying for, even if those principles involve the tedious details of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The sword has done its work. Now begins the longer work of turning blood into blessing, murder into martyrdom, a dead archbishop into an immortal saint. You've finally found a position from which Henry cannot remove you, a height from which you cannot fall. It only cost you everything, which, knowing you, probably seemed like a fair exchange. Good night, Thomas. Good night, Canterbury. Good night to knights riding through snow, with blood on their swords and dawning horror in their hearts. Tomorrow the world will begin to understand what happened here. Tonight there are only candles and consequences, flickering in the darkness, where archbishop became saint, where ending became beginning, where death became the kind of victory that lasts forever. Sleep well. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.